And I know you're as anxious as I am to get into close action. But we must bring him right up beside us before we spring this trap. That will test our nerve. And discipline will count just as much as courage.
The Age of Fighting Sail. Part 5. Pomp and Pageantry over Military Strategy.
Nothing equals the beautiful order of the English at sea. Never was there a line drawn straighter than that formed by their ships. Thus they bring all their fire to bear upon those who draw near them.
This admiring comment on the Royal Navy's battle formation was made by a French admiral in 1666. It was an accurate depiction of the tactics that made England supreme on the seas for 100 years, and then failed her utterly at the Battle of Ushant, and most importantly at a critical juncture during the American Revolution. As Keppel had demonstrated so unhappily off Ushant, the essential tactic was the line ahead. The French admiral had described it most accurately. The formation consisted of a perfectly straight line of sailing warships presenting a moving wall of fire against the enemy. In the constantly changing circumstances of naval battle, the line ahead had so many advantages. It concentrated the fleet's firepower in one direction. It prevented such accidents as ships of the same fleet firing on one another or firing past or through an enemy ship at a friendly vessel. Most of all, it gave each captain clear and simple directions. He was to hold his place in line and focus his fire on enemy ships opposite his own. The first fighting instructions had been issued in 1653 under Oliver Cromwell, who was an early and ardent advocate of a powerful navy. The rules were revised and expanded in 1703, but the basic tactics remained the same. And of all the orders laid down in the fighting instructions, the Navy's manual, the most sacred decreed, "All the ships of every squadron shall endeavor to keep in line with the chief." Moreover, the penalty for not holding such a line was severe punishment, which could mean anything for a captain from a public reprimand to death, depending on the circumstances. The fighting instructions reiterated, "None of the ships of the fleet shall pursue any small number of the enemy's ships till the main body be disabled or run." So the Royal Navy concentrated on its single majestic and overpowering line-ahead formation. Even after the frustrating standoff against the French at Ushant, the Admiralty remained certain that traditional methods would be more than enough to win the naval engagements of the American Revolutionary War. For one thing, the American Navy was scarcely worthy of the name Navy. As an organization, it had been bungled from the start. Shipbuilding contracts were let for political reasons, and construction was delayed. The first American captains were no match for their Royal Naval counterparts. The statistics tell the sad story of America's first Navy. Of the 50 warships built and bought for the Continental Navy during the war, all but one were lost to enemy action, having been either sunk, captured, or scuttled. Meanwhile, the Americans took only 5 small ships of the Royal Navy. The only significant damage done to the British by the Americans at sea was accomplished by more than 1,600 privateers that were commissioned and sent out to harass British shipping. They captured something like 1,000 British merchantmen and caused an astronomical rise in shipping insurance rates. But they were little more than a nuisance to the Royal Navy, which destroyed even more American shipping. One officer in the Continental Navy managed in 1779 to bring the war into England's home waters, but sensational as was John Paul Jones's victory in the Bonhomme Richard over the Serapis, it amounted to little more than a psychological blow to the Royal Navy. The real challenge once again came from across the Channel. The sheer belligerency of France in 1778 turned the American Revolution from a shifting series of land battles into a truly maritime war. The armies, British, Hessian, American, and French, fought from the Canadian border to South Carolina, but the ultimate outcome was decided by the navies of Great Britain and France. The Battle of Ushant not only demonstrated that the line-ahead formation was outdated, it also showed that the French Navy of 1778 was superior in a number of respects. This dramatic change could be accounted for in London as well as in Paris. During the 12 years of peace between the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution, the Royal Navy had been victimized by gouging profiteering by the Navy's suppliers. Meanwhile, King Louis XV's powerful advisor, the Duc de Choiseul, rallied Frenchmen in a campaign to rebuild their navy. Fund drives supplemented the royal treasuries with money to construct new ships. They were named after the groups of towns that contributed, the most impressive being the 104-gun Ville de Paris. It was Choiseul who inaugurated the academies of marine architecture that were responsible for the better designed, faster sailing French men of war. Under Choiseul's direction, a corps of 10,000 naval gunners was organized and rigorously drilled in the art of accurate naval fire. By 1770, when Choiseul left office, France had 64 ships of the line and 50 frigates. By 1778, when France entered the war on America's side, she had 80 ships of the line. In the following year, Spain honored the Bourbon family compact with France by declaring war on England, adding 60 ships of the line to the combined force confronting England. The Royal Navy did have about 150 major ships to counter these 140, but not all were fit for sea at the time. Moreover, the French gunners were now more accurate than the British, and were at their best at long range. This was important because of the new French strategy of avoiding pitched battle with any enemy force that was not clearly inferior in numbers. Up until now, the Royal Navy had not yet actually lost a sea battle. The new French tactics of hit and run had so far thwarted every British attempt to force a line-to-line slugging match. In one battle after another, the British admiral would stubbornly form his line ahead, the French would cut up his rigging and sail away to fight again. In strictly naval terms, this situation might be called a standoff. The effects were felt on the battlefields of North America, since the French Navy was increasingly able to deliver reinforcements to the Americans and to the French soldiers who had joined them. One of those who could see the advantages of the new French naval strategy was General George Washington. For the first 4 years of the war, with nothing but the ineffectual Continental Navy for support, the American war had gone badly. Now the French Navy was helping to turn the tide. In the summer of 1781, Washington thought he could see the makings of a devastating combined American-French operation. A large French fleet was in the West Indies, endeavoring to take advantage of Britain's preoccupation with the colonies and to recapture some of the islands France had lost in the 7 Years' War, 18 years before. If that force, or part of it, could come north to support a campaign that Washington and the French general, the Marquis Gilbert du Montée de Lafayette, were planning, the colonists might win one of the most important victories of the war. Major General Earl Cornwallis, with more than 7,000 of Britain's finest troops, was encamped in Yorktown, on the Virginia shore of Chesapeake Bay. If a French fleet could block the narrow entrance to the bay, thereby cutting off Cornwallis's supply line, the Americans and French could launch a pincer attack and wipe out Britain's best army in the colonies. Washington wrote a letter to the French minister to the colonies, the Chevalier de Luzerne, stressing what the American general saw as the essential importance of naval superiority in the war and pleading for the French fleet to come north. The commander of the French fleet in the West Indies was Rear Admiral Comte François-Joseph Paul de Grasse, an aristocrat born in a feudal castle in the Alps Maritimes, now 59 years old and quite an imposing quarterdeck figure at 6 feet 2 inches tall. One admirer claimed he was 6 feet 6 inches on days of battle. De Grasse responded to the call from the colonies with his entire fleet. En route north, he lost 2 of his ships to the same bizarre type of accident, a sailor doling out the ration of tafia. The brandy, that was the French equivalent of grog, knocked over a candle and set the ship afire. First, the 74-gun Intrépide, and then the 40-gun Inconstant were destroyed this way, and de Grasse ordered that thereafter a responsible officer must preside over every issue of tafia. Still, de Grasse had 28 ships of the line to take north. Crowded aboard the men of war were 3 regiments of French infantry, 100 dragoons, and 350 artillerymen, 2,500 soldiers in all to reinforce Lafayette's troops. Their equipment and artillery were carried aboard 15 merchantmen that de Grasse chartered with money from his personal fortune. To avoid detection by British frigates in the Atlantic, de Grasse fled his fleet through the treacherous shoal-dotted Bahama Channel between Cuba and the Bahamas. By mid-August 1781, the entire armada was riding north in the Gulf Stream off Florida, and on the evening of August 29th, the fleet dropped anchor inside the entrance to Chesapeake Bay, picking off in the process a few British frigates that had not been quick enough to slip out of the bay. It happened that de Grasse's serpentine approach to the colonies had served him in a way he did not know. His departure from the West Indies had been discovered by the British, and Rear Admiral Sir Samuel Hood left Antigua on August 10th with 14 ships of the line to search for him. By sailing a straight line course instead of cutting between Cuba and the Bahamas, Hood was off of the American coast ahead of de Grasse. On August 25th, 4 days before the French fleet arrived, Hood looked into Chesapeake Bay, found that it was all clear, and sailed on to New York. The commander of the British fleet in New York, Rear Admiral Thomas Graves, had no news of de Grasse. He was more concerned at the report that another French force, a squadron of 8 warships under Commodore Comte de Barras, was transporting a shipment of siege artillery from Newport, Rhode Island, to the French and Americans surrounding Cornwallis at Yorktown. Graves and Hood agreed to join forces and, with 19 ships of the line, to sail for Chesapeake Bay to head off to Barras. While they were about it, they took along supplies and 2,000 troops to reinforce Cornwallis. New Yorkers were thereupon given a first-hand example of Britain's press gangs at work as the Royal Navy rounded up 400 colonists to help man the British ships. A press gang officer later recorded that the procedure furnished us with a droll yet distressing scene, taking the husband from the arms of his wife in bed, the searching for them when hid beneath the warm clothes, and the better to prevent the delay of taking them naked, while the frantic partner of his bed, forgetting the delicacy of her sex, pursued us to the doors with shrieks and imprecations, and exposing their naked persons to the rude view of an unfeeling press gang. Early on the morning of September 5th, as the British fleet approached the mouth of Chesapeake Bay, one of Graves's lookouts announced that there were some masts just inside the entrance. It looked as if de Barras and his squadron had already arrived. The 8 French ships would be easy victims for Graves' 19. But as the British fleet drew closer to the mouth of the bay, the lookouts reported a veritable forest of masts. Graves did not know it at the time, and would provide an even nastier shock in due course, but the Comte de Barras' 8-ship squadron was not among the vessels he was studying. De Barras was still en route from Newport, laying a circuitous course south as far as the Carolinas to avoid detection by the British. These ships, as Graves would discover, were those of Admiral Francois de Grasse. There were 24 of them, 4 vessels having been sent on other missions, and as Graves would also discover, de Grasse was a brilliant tactician. But for the moment, all the advantage, surprise, position, wind, tide, everything save numbers lay with the British. De Grasse's fleet was anchored in Lynnhaven Roads along the southern shore and inside Cape Henry. As the British drew near enough to be identified, the French exploded into frantic activity, unfurling sails, slipping anchor cables, and leaving them tied to buoys in the harbor. In utter confusion, they scrambled to clear the bay for the Atlantic, where they could employ their tactics of firing at British ships' tops and running out to sea. Graves was thereby presented with an even greater opportunity than he had anticipated on leaving New York. Here was a numerically superior French fleet virtually at his mercy. The wind was northeast, blowing into the bay. The French were thus up against a lee shore with an incoming tide against them as well. Nor could they maneuver into any fighting formation because of a shoal called the Middle Ground in the center of the bay's entrance. The ship channel at this period was only 3 miles wide. All Graves had to do was send his 19 men of war down onto the scattered flock of 24 Frenchmen and pick them off one after the other. In fact, the French were in an even more perilous state than they appeared. Nearly 1,300 of de Grasse's officers and crewmen, close to half of the total, were ashore ferrying the troops and artillery they had brought from the West Indies. De Grasse's flagship, the Ville de Paris, was short 200 men. The 74-gun Citoyen did not have enough sailors to man her upper-deck guns. At the moment, the situation looked hopeless for de Grasse, but soon he could cry out with delight at what Graves was doing, or rather not doing. Instead of sending a spreading net of ships close to the exit of the harbor, the British admiral was leisurely keeping to the classic formation of the fighting instructions. The Union Jack flew up at the mizzen peak of Graves's flagship, the London, signaling the line ahead, as the stately procession moved down on the entrance of the bay. By the time Graves, maintaining perfect formation, finally reached the middle ground at the mouth of the bay, the fleeing French had largely cleared the entrance, and were in the process of forming a line of their own. Whereupon, still in precise formation, Graves laboriously maneuvered his entire fleet around the same orderly line, heading back to sea. As if at a formal review, the British fleet sailed in and out of the entrance of Chesapeake Bay. Each ship kept her place in the formation without a break in the line. It was an impressive spectacle, precise, orchestrated, beautifully, and utterly worthless. What is more, by reversing his line, Graves had compounded the error. Now his weakest ships, which had been in the rear, were in the van, and would now have to lead the attack if there was one. He himself was the 10th ship of the line. The new leader was the Captain Mark Robinson in the 74-gun Shrewsbury. Following the fighting instructions, Graves intended to sail along the French line and bombard it to splinters, that is, once the French formed a line. But at this point the French had no line, and with no enemy line to oppose, Graves's single line was helpless. It was now mid-afternoon. Rounding Cape Henry, the French ships finally fell into a rough line as they hurried out into the ocean. This gave Graves a chance, but he lost it. Heading for the straggling French line, he kept his line-ahead signal, so his straight, unwavering column brought the British up against the French at an angle, in a V instead of parallel lines, with the result that only the British van, the lead ships of the line, came close enough to engage the French. Graves then used a combination of signals that was argued about for years thereafter. He hoisted a white pennant with a blue and white checkered flag beneath it, signaling bear down and engage more closely, but he also kept his line ahead flying signal. Bear down meant that every captain could turn toward the enemy and attack the nearest French ship, but this would no longer be line ahead. And most of Graves' captains, especially Hood, commanding the rear in the Barfleur, knew what the fighting instructions said about that. Line ahead always superseded other signals, so Hood and the others in the center and rear stuck by the book, and they kept the line straight. Graves was thus attacking a superior force with only a part of his inferior force, and de Grasse's gunners shortly proved their mettle. As the converging fleets met at the point of the V, the leading Shrewsbury shook under the fire of the French ship Pluton. One shower of cannonballs swept the Shrewsbury deck, ripping the left leg off Captain Robinson and killing the first lieutenant and 13 of the crew. Succeeding blasts from the Pluton killed 12 more of Shrewsbury's sailors and injured 46. The Shrewsbury's main mast and mizzenmast were shot through, and her sails and spars were so riddled with shot that she had to fall out of the line. When Captain Anthony Malloy tried to bring the second British ship, the 64-gun Intrepid, to the Shrewsbury support, he came under even heavier fire from the French 74-gun Marseillais. With her main topmast nearly cut in two, her sails in tatters, her rudder damaged, 19 shot holes between wind and water, and 21 killed and 35 wounded, the Intrepid also drifted out of the line. De Grasse's ships did not escape without damage. A broadside from the Princessa in the British van swept the decks of Réfléchi, killing the captain, and the Augusta ran into a withering fire of British musketry as well as cannon. The Augusta's foretop bowline was shot away, threatening to send the foretop crashing down to the deck. 2 French sailors were shot as they climbed up to repair the bowline. A third Frenchman thereupon scrambled to the foretop, repaired it while shot flew around him, and then slid safely back to the deck. Admiral Comte Louis-Antoine de Bougainville summoned the young man to the quarterdeck and offered him his purse, but the sailor refused. The opening guns of the battle had fired just after noon of September 5th. It was almost dusk before Graves lowered his line-ahead signal, which then permitted his captains to turn toward the nearest enemy, but it was too late. De Grasse had escaped what should have been a calamitous trap without a loss of a single ship. In killed and wounded, he had inflicted 336 casualties on the British, while suffering only 230 casualties himself. The British were seething with recrimination. In an angry post-mortem aboard his flagship, the London, Graves demanded to know why Hood had not turned out into the line to engage the enemy. Hood coolly replied that the signal for line ahead was still up. Graves turned to the man who had led the van into action, Rear Admiral Francis S. Drake, a descendant of the great Elizabethan hero. Why, Graves asked, had Drake engaged the enemy? On account of the signal for action, Drake replied. Graves triumphantly turned back to Hood and asked, "What say you to this, Admiral Hood?" Sir Samuel said calmly, "The signal for the line was enough for me." It did not help matters that Graves next allowed de Grasse to outmaneuver him again, this time to the disaster of Cornwallis and the British forces fighting at Yorktown. On September 6, seeking to prevent de Grasse from blockading Cornwallis, again Graves went after the French fleet, which was lying off Cape Henry. For 5 days, de Grasse led Graves on a wide circle out into the Atlantic and back toward Chesapeake Bay, slowing when the British fell behind, speeding up again when they began to close, always remaining temptingly and infuriatingly near. It was a superb stratagem, for while de Grasse was playing hare and hounds, the 8 warships of his comrade-in-arms, the Comte de Barras, arrived at Chesapeake Bay, as de Grasse knew they would, and proceeded to land their heavy artillery for the French and American troops besieging Cornwallis. To make matters infinitely worse for the hapless Graves, he was now faced with 32 French ships of the line, most of them in better shape than his vessels. And now his fleet was down to 18. The Terrible had been so weakened by the battle and subsequent chase that Graves had ordered her scuttled. The crowning blow came when the French took up a blocking position across the entrance to the bay. There followed an icy exchange of notes between the London and the Barfleur. Admiral Graves presents his compliments to Sir Samuel Hood and desires his opinion on what to do with the fleet. the reply from Hood, Sir Samuel presents his compliments to Rear Admiral Graves, and would be very glad to send an opinion, but he really knows not what to say in the truly lamentable state that we have brought ourselves. With resignation, Graves summoned another conference in his cabin. There was, all agreed, no alternative. The fleet would have to return to New York for repairs and reinforcement. This sorry aggregation arrived on September 20th. It was a month before a refurbished contingent of 25 ships of the line could sail again for Chesapeake Bay. They were too late. On October 19th, just after the British fleet had departed New York, Cornwallis's band at Yorktown played The World Turned Upside Down, and his troops marched out to surrender to General George Washington and his army. The fighting on land continued for another year, but the war had already been lost for the British at Yorktown, in considerable measure because of the failures of the Royal Navy and its outmoded line-ahead tactics. The Royal Navy was about to meet its match, but the Admiralty did not yet realize the situation. Yet, even this catastrophe did not destroy the Admiralty's faith in the traditional methods. For one thing, there seemed to be no suitable alternative. Not one that the Admiralty wished to recognize, anyway. But in fact, there was. In Edinburgh, Scotland, John Clerk, an amateur tabletop tactician, a landlubber playing with ship models, had already devised a new set of tactics that would help greatly in making the Royal Navy supreme once again, though it would take a while for his theories to penetrate the upper echelons of the naval establishment.